Okay, let's unpack this. Have you ever felt like there's maybe a deeper story, a hidden truth, just sort of lurking beneath the surface of what we're usually told, especially about like ancient texts and spiritual history? Well, today we're diving headfirst into exactly that. Our source material is this absolutely compelling book, Big Brother's Holy Shockers, The Untold Stories. Mm. And good news for those of you who've been waiting, you can actually grab this incredible collection right now on Amazon. It's described as raw, unfiltered Bible truths they don't want you to read. Pretty bold claim. So our mission today for this deep dive is to really explore these censored, controversial, and honestly pretty mind-bending stories. These are narratives that challenge a lot of the mainstream interpretations many of us grew up with. We're going to try and peel back some layers here, layers of myth and mystery, and uncover these hidden dimensions of biblical history and the spiritual warfare that's apparently been raging behind the scenes since, well, the very beginning. I think you're going to have some serious aha moments today.
Yeah, and what's really fascinating about digging into these untold stories is just how crucial they feel for anyone who wants to, gain knowledge quickly but also thoroughly. The book itself, it really aims to provide those illuminating insights, those aha moments you mentioned, but without completely overloading you with information, which can happen with these really dense ancient topics. It's more about connecting dots.
Yeah.
Dots you might not have even known existed before, really reshaping how you understand history, spirituality, maybe even yourself.
Speaking of connecting dots, let's just jump right into it. The source starts with what it calls the very first contradiction in Eden. This is that classic setup, right? Genesis 2.17 versus Genesis 3.4. So on one side, God warns Adam, "In the day that thou eatest thereof, thou shalt surely die." Pretty clear warning. But then the serpent slides in and tells Eve, "Ye shall not surely die." Now, if you just read that casually, it kind of looks like God didn't tell the truth, doesn't it? Because Adam and Eve, well, they didn't instantly drop dead. They lived physically for like centuries after that. So how does the book handle this apparent discrepancy?
Yeah, it tackles that common misconception head on. And that's really where the first big aha moment kicks in. The key insight, the book argues, is understanding that God's warning in Genesis 2.1 wasn't primarily talking about immediate physical death.
Okay, so not like healing over on the spot, something different.
Exactly, something much more profound and immediate in its own way. The argument is that the immediate consequence was spiritual death.
Spiritual death. Okay, unpack that a bit. What does that mean in practical terms for Adam and Eve right then?
Well, think about what happened the moment they ate the fruit. What did they do?
They realized they were naked, they felt ashamed, they hid from God.
Right. That's it. An immediate separation from God's presence. They lost their innocence, they felt shame and guilt for the very first time, and their instinct was to hide from the one they previously walked with freely. That was the immediate death God warned about. A spiritual rift, a fundamental breaking of that open fellowship, that connection with their Creator. It completely reframes how we understand that first sin, doesn't it?
It really does. And is this just, a convenient way to smooth over a tricky verse? Or does the book connect this interpretation to other parts of the Bible?
Oh, absolutely. It's not just an isolated interpretation. The book makes a strong case by linking it directly to later biblical understanding, specifically mentioning Romans 5.12.
Romans 5.1. Okay, remind us.
That verse says, "Wherefore, as by one man sin entered into the world, and death by sin, and so death passed upon all men."
Yeah.
See, Romans 5.12 helps us understand that the death that passed onto all humanity isn't just about physical dying someday. It's primarily about this spiritual state, this separation from God's life-giving presence that results from sin.
Got it. So the original death in Eden, the immediate one, was this spiritual break, this loss of communion.
Precisely. And then physical death became a consequence of that spiritual separation and disobedience. Sort of a natural outworking of being disconnected from the source of life. It wasn't the primary meaning of the warning itself, rather a result down the line. This understanding really deepens how we see sin's impact. It's cosmic. It affects the soul's connection to God.
Wow, okay. Which means the serpent's line, "You shall not surely die," wasn't just a simple lie about whether they'd drop dead. It was actually much more insidious, a deliberate deception, twisting God's warning to trap them spiritually.
Absolutely. A masterclass in deception right from the start. It underscores the very nature of evil and temptation. The serpent's words were a distortion designed to cloud the real spiritual consequences of disobedience, to make them doubt God, to make them think God was maybe lying or, holding something good back from them.
Yeah.
And understanding this divine truth, as the source puts it, is so vital. It reveals the root of human separation from God. It highlights why we should take divine warnings seriously. And it really lays the groundwork for the whole concept of spiritual salvation, of needing redemption to restore that broken fellowship. It changes how you read everything that follows in Genesis.
Definitely. And that foundational shift in understanding Eden, it really sets the stage for exploring even deeper, maybe even more hidden mysteries in the Bible. Because if God's words there had such a profound, perhaps veiled meaning, what else might be lurking just beneath the surface? Which brings us, I think, to one of the most controversial and frankly mind-bending sections in this book, the Nephilim files.
Ah, yes, the Nephilim, giants, angels, and forbidden bloodlines. This focuses on that incredibly cryptic passage in Genesis 6, verses 1 through 4. You know, the one, it talks about the sons of God interacting with the daughters of men, and the result being the birth of these figures called the Nephilim. For centuries, people have debated who exactly were these sons of God.
Right. I remember hearing the sort of standard explanation that it was just the righteous line of Seth intermarrying with the ungodly line of Cain, just humans marrying humans. But the book pushes back on that, doesn't it? It takes a much more supernatural approach.
It absolutely does. It aligns with much older interpretations actually
Yeah.
found in ancient Jewish tradition and various extra-biblical texts. Specifically, it brings in the book of Enoch as a crucial text that, quote, expands dramatically on Genesis 6.
The Book of Enoch, okay, maybe explain that briefly for listeners who aren't familiar. It's not in most Bibles, right?
Correct. When we say extra-biblical, we mean ancient writings that weren't included in the final official canon of the Bible as we know it today, but they were often highly regarded in ancient times and can shed significant light on the context, the belief, the stories circulating back then. And according to Enoch, these sons of God from Genesis 6 were not human descendants of Seth. They were watchers,
Watchers.
angelic beings, members of the divine council, essentially, who rebelled against God's order.
Wow, okay, so fallen angels, and Enoch names names, like leaders.
Yes, it does. It names key leaders like Semjaza and Azazel. And their transgression wasn't just, inappropriate relationships. According to Enoch, these watchers made a pact, a conspiracy, to descend to earth, take human wives. And this is critical to they also taught humanity forbidden knowledge.
Forbidden knowledge, like what?
We're talking deep secrets, things like witchcraft, enchantments, astrology, divination, but also metallurgy for making weapons, the art of warfare, even cosmetics, interestingly enough, framed as tools of seduction. And their illicit unions, this mixing of angelic and human, broke the divine order and resulted in the birth of the Nephilim.
The Nephilim, which means fallen ones, or giants.
Both translations are suggested. The key point is they weren't just unusually tall humans. They were understood as supernatural hybrids, corrupt, incredibly violent, and completely outside the natural order. Think monstrous beings.
So the book really emphasizes their role as this corrupting influence, a literal contamination of the human race and the earth itself. And this is what ultimately led to the Great Flood.
That's the argument. The problem wasn't just that humans had become wicked on their own. It was that this supernatural intervention had gone disastrously wrong, corrupting humanity from the inside out, teaching destructive arts, and creating these hybrid beings that threatened all of creation.
It sounds less like just punishing bad behavior and more like a necessary cosmic cleansing.
Exactly. And the narrative connects this directly to verses within the canonical Bible, like Jude verse 6 and 2 Peter 2.4. Both those passages powerfully mention angels who sinned, who left their proper domain and are now bound in darkness or chains awaiting judgment. So while brief, these New Testament verses lend significant weight to the idea that fallen angels played a major corrupting role early on. It redefined spiritual warfare, showing it wasn't just an abstract concept, but involved actual physical and genetic corruption right at the start.
And it's fascinating how the source points out that legends of giants pop up in so many ancient cultures around the world. You know, the Anakim and Rephaim in the Bible itself, the Greek Titans, Norse Jotun, maybe even whispers of the Anunnaki from Mesopotamia. It's like a shared cultural memory, almost.
It does suggest a deep, perhaps forgotten stratum of shared myth or memory. The book even touches briefly on modern, though often debated, archaeological finds alleged giant skeletons or massive, unexplained megalithic structures as things that keep this ancient mystery alive in the popular imagination.
So understanding this Nephilim story, according to the source, it reveals the really deep spiritual roots of evil. It provides context for ongoing spiritual warfare, and it even introduces this idea of forbidden bloodlines, potentially carrying spiritual curses down through generations from these ancient unions.
Precisely. It's not just a weird old story about giants. It's presented as foundational for understanding the cosmic battle, the origins of certain evils, and the lengths to which rebellious forces went to corrupt God's creation.
Okay, so if the Nephilim story just blows the lid off our usual understanding of early Genesis, then one of the most central figures connected to all these of the Watchers, the pre-flood world, has got to be Enoch himself. Genesis gives us that tantalizingly brief mention, but our source says his story is far more extensive than Genesis lets on.
Absolutely. Chapter 3 is titled, Enoch Walked with God, Then Disappeared.
Yeah.
And you're right, Genesis 5.24 is incredibly brief. Enoch walked faithfully with God, then he was no more, because God took him away. And Hebrews 11.5 adds he was translated that he should not see death. That's basically all the canonical Bible tells us directly.
He's unique, though, isn't he? He and Elijah are the only ones said to have bypassed death entirely, taken straight to heaven. That sounds like a really special kind of divine favor.
It really does. A divine translation, an elevation unlike almost any other. It underscores his incredible righteousness and closeness to God. And the Book of Enoch, which claims to contain his revelations, fills in the gaps dramatically. It describes his heavenly journey.
A heavenly journey, like literally traveling through the heavens.
That's the account. Guided by angels, ascending through multiple heavens, being shown the mysteries of creation and the divine order. Imagine getting a guided tour of the cosmos from angels.
Wow. What kind of mysteries did he supposedly see? Was it just about the stars and planets or more?
Oh, much more. The book highlights specific sections, like Enoch 14 and 22, that detail his profound visions. He apparently saw the different levels of heaven, the very throne of God, vast angelic hosts, the storehouses of snow and hail. It's described as him seeing the spiritual laws that govern both the physical and the spiritual worlds, how angels are assigned to celestial bodies, the whole cosmic infrastructure, you might say.
So he got the cosmic blueprint. And did he also get more detail on the fallen angels, the Watchers, during this journey?
Yes, absolutely. He receives detailed revelations about their conspiracy, how they descended, the specific forbidden knowledge they taught, things like black magic, astrology, weaponry, enchantments, even herbalism used for nefarious purposes. And he saw the direct result, the widespread corruption of humanity. It really paints a picture of intense, ancient spiritual warfare, providing that crucial backstory to the ongoing struggle between good and evil.
And Enoch wasn't just seeing the past or the structure of the cosmos, right? He was also shown the future. He had prophetic insights.
Indeed. His visions, as recorded in the Book of Enoch, included prophecies about the coming judgment, the flood, but also looking much further ahead, the rise of a messianic figure, the final resurrection of the dead, and the ultimate judgment of both wicked humans and fallen angels. The source notes how strikingly these prophecies align with themes and even specific imagery found much later in the biblical book of Revelation. It suggests Enoch saw the beginning and the end of the cosmic drama.
This really deepens the understanding of the spiritual realm, angelic rebellion, prophecy, spiritual warfare, in a way that just reading Genesis alone doesn't provide. Enoch's story, even if it's outside the main canon for most, becomes this powerful example of what it means to truly walk with God, to have that kind of fellowship and the incredible revelations that can come from it.
Absolutely. His story, though often marginalized, presents him as someone granted almost unparalleled access to divine mysteries. He becomes a critical witness to the origins of creation, the roots of corruption, and the unfolding plan of redemption. It suggests truth extends far beyond just the human realm.
And these profound visions Enoch had, especially about human rebellion and divine intervention, they lead us pretty naturally to another huge event in early Genesis that the book suggests has a much deeper, more spiritual meaning than we usually assume: the Tower of Babel.
Right, moving into ancient conspiracies and lost histories. The Tower of Babel, Genesis 11. Usually, it's taught as a simple story about human pride. People trying to build a really tall tower to make a name for themselves. God gets upset, confuses their languages, scatters them. End of story. But the source material in the chapter called the Tower of Babel Conspiracy argues it was much, much more than that. It calls it a strategic attempt at spiritual invasion and rebellion against divine authority.
Spiritual invasion. That's a really strong claim. How does it move from an ambitious building project to an attempted spiritual invasion? What's the evidence for that interpretation?
A key piece is looking closely at God's own words in Genesis 11.6. God observes the unified people and says nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. The book suggests this hints at an immense, almost terrifying power that unified human effort could wield, especially if directed against divine purposes. It wasn't just about height. It was about potential. A potential threat, not just to, God's ego, but to the divine order itself.
Okay. So they weren't just trying to physically reach heaven.
The argument is no. It was more symbolic or even literal in a spiritual sense. They were potentially trying to create a spiritual bridge, a gateway, maybe even a portal to challenge God's sovereignty, perhaps even allowing access for rebellious spiritual forces.
And doesn't the source bring in some other ancient texts here, like different versions of Deuteronomy?
Exactly. It points to Deuteronomy 32.8, specifically referencing the Septuagint, that's the ancient Greek translation, and readings found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. These older versions suggest that after Babel, when God scattered humanity, he divided the nations according to the number of the sons of God, or angels.
Sons of God, like the Watchers we just talked about.
Potentially, or at least other members of the divine council. The implication is that spiritual beings were assigned influence or authority over different nations. This interpretation reframes Babel not just as a human project, but as a focal point for both human and angelic rebellion converging. A place designed to challenge the Most High, to establish a stronghold of false power on earth.
So, a concerted effort involving more than just humans, aimed at usurping divine authority. And the Book of Jasher, which the source mentions, adds more detail about Nimrod.
Yes, we'll get more into Jasher itself soon, but it reportedly describes Nimrod, the leader associated with Babel, not just as a mighty hunter, but as a really cunning and ambitious ruler, someone who deliberately manipulated people into rebellion against God, seeking to elevate himself above God by unifying humanity under his own defiant agenda. Jasher apparently paints Babel as his project, a very deliberate act.
Wow, this definitely puts the Babel story into that larger context of spiritual warfare we've been tracing. It becomes an example of how rebellious forces, both human and angelic, might try to establish these strongholds of false power. It really underscores the need for, spiritual discernment today, too. These attempts at spiritual invasion or deception could take many forms, maybe even through systems or institutions that challenge God's authority.
It's a powerful reminder, isn't it? That unity, when it's detached from divine purpose, can become incredibly dangerous, a tool for rebellion rather than godly progress.
And you mentioned the Book of Jasher. That leads us perfectly into the next piece. This intriguing text that the source calls hidden in plain sight. Hidden because, well, most people haven't heard of it, but it's actually referenced in the Bible.
Exactly. The Book of Jasher, hidden in plain sight. It's fascinating because it gets explicitly quoted twice in the Old Testament. Joshua 10.13 mentions it when the sun and moon stand still. Is this not written in the Book of Jasher?
Mm-hmm.
And 2 Samuel 1.18 refers to it containing the lament of the bow, a song about Saul and Jonathan. So these references clearly validate that it was a known, likely respected, historical or poetic record at the time the Bible was being compiled, which raises the big question.
Why isn't it in our Bibles now? If it was important enough to be quoted, why was it eventually excluded from most canons?
That's the mystery. The source explores theories, maybe it contained controversial content, things that didn't fit neatly with later theological developments, or maybe it offered alternate perspectives that challenged the emerging Orthodox narrative.
What kind of controversial content are we talking about? You mentioned Nimrod and Babel already.
Right. Jasher's expanded version of Babel is apparently much more detailed and damning regarding Nimrod. It portrays him as this central, cunning figure who actively consolidated power and drove the tower's construction as that deliberate act of defiance. The source even suggests Jasher paints Nimrod as a kind of prototype of later Antichrist figures, this powerful, charismatic leader unifying humanity against God. That's pretty controversial stuff.
Yeah, definitely paints a darker, more specific picture. What else does Jasher add? Does it cover the flood, too?
It reportedly gives a much more detailed account of the pre-flood era. It describes the corruption of humankind in stark terms, emphasizes the rise of the Nephilim and their impact, details Noah's struggles and warnings more fully. It apparently shows how the forbidden knowledge from the Watchers spread violence and sorcery, really accelerating humanity's downfall. It also expands on the practicalities like the gathering of the animals, adding layers to the Genesis story.
And what about the patriarchs? Abraham, Jacob, etc. Does Jasher fill in gaps there too? The source mentions missing years.
Yes, that's another major contribution attributed to Jasher. It offers a more in-depth portrayal of the patriarchs: Adam, Enoch, Methuselah, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. It's said to provide missing context, genealogical details, insights into their personal struggles, their encounters with idolatry, perhaps even lingering influences of fallen angels or giants. For example, it might detail rivalries like between Abraham and Nimrod, or give more background on Jacob and Esau. It really fleshes out the human drama.
It sounds like Jasher, if these accounts are accurate, offers a potential treasure trove of lost biblical history and spiritual insight, something that could really enrich our understanding of Genesis and this ongoing battle between good and evil.
Absolutely. Whether one accepts it as divinely inspired scripture or simply as a valuable ancient historical text, it undeniably provides context. It helps understand the ancient world, the narratives they wrestled with, the spiritual landscape they perceived. It fuels those debates about suppressed truths and makes you wonder about the process of canon formation, what got included, what got left out, and why. It's a reminder that history, especially sacred history, is often more complex than the final edited version might suggest.
And Jasher isn't the only ancient source hinting at figures or narratives that sit outside the main canonical tradition. There's another really mysterious and frankly controversial figure, Lilith. She challenges our understanding of creation itself right at the very beginning.
Indeed. Chapter 6. Lilith, the first woman or a demon queen. This is a really fascinating dive into a figure who is notably absent from the canonical Genesis account, but looms large in ancient Hebrew myths, folklore, and later mystical writings. The core idea is that she, according to these traditions, either predated Eve or was perhaps created alongside Adam as the first woman, offering a radical alternative to the Genesis 2 story.
And the source suggests this myth might have arisen partly because of a seeming discrepancy within Genesis itself, between chapter 1 and chapter 2.
That's one theory. Genesis 1.27 says God created mankind in his image, male and female created he them, which sounds simultaneous. But then Genesis 2.22 describes Eve being formed later, specifically from Adam's rib. Some ancient interpreters noticed this tension, and one way to reconcile it was to posit two creations. First, Lilith, created equally from the earth like Adam, and second, Eve, created later from Adam himself.
Okay, so where does the story of Lilith actually come from? What's the earliest source?
The earliest detailed literary reference is generally considered to be the Alphabet of Ben Sira, which is a medieval Jewish text, maybe 8th to 10th century AD, though it might preserve older traditions. In that satirical, somewhat edgy text, Lilith is Adam's first wife, created from the same earth. Because she was created equally, she insisted on absolute equality, particularly refusing to lie beneath Adam during sex. She wouldn't accept his authority. When he tried to force her, she uttered God's ineffable name, gained power, and flew away from Eden in defiance, eventually becoming a demoness associated with the night and harming infants.
Wow. So she's portrayed as fiercely independent, but also incredibly defiant, ultimately becoming this malevolent force. Is there any potential hint of her in the actual Bible?
It's debated, but the source points to Isaiah 34.14. In the King James Version, for instance, describing the desolation of Edom, it mentions that the screech owl shall rest there. The Hebrew word translated as screech owl is Lilith. Many scholars connect this Lilith to the much older Mesopotamian night demon Lilitu, a winged female demon associated with storms, disease, and death, particularly of infants. So while not a full story, the name appears, linking to this demonic archetype.
And then later, Jewish mysticism, like the Kabbalah, really ran with this figure, right? Making her even more prominent.
Or absolutely. In Kabbalistic literature, Lilith becomes a major demonic figure. She's often depicted as the queen of demons, sometimes the consort of Semal, a chief demon, sometimes seen as Satan. She embodies untamed female sexuality, seduction, chaos, spiritual rebellion against divine and patriarchal order. She becomes this powerful, dark, feminine archetype associated with the night, the moon, lust, and preying on men and babies. People used amulets and incantations for protection against her.
It's incredible how this figure, whether mythological or rooted in some lost tradition, reveals such deep anxieties in ancient societies about gender roles, female power, authority, and the nature of evil itself.
Exactly. Her story serves as both a cautionary tale against perceived dangers of female independence and untamed sexuality, but also, in modern interpretations, she's sometimes reclaimed as a symbol of female empowerment and rebellion against oppressive structures.
It really shows how these hidden or marginalized figures can still illuminate powerful cultural and spiritual dynamics that resonate across centuries. Even if she's not in Genesis, her story tells us a lot.
It certainly does. She embodies that tension between order and chaos, submission and rebellion, the sacred and the profane, particularly through a female lens.
Okay, so from figures of ancient myth like Lilith, the book pulls us back to the chilling and perhaps more literal realities of that pre-flood world. Tying back to the Watchers and Nephilim, it talks about cannibal kings. This sounds truly terrifying.
Yes, Chapter 7. Cannibal Kings in the Days of Noah. The shocking truth about giants before the flood. This aims to uncover the horrific reality of that era, going beyond Genesis' statement that the earth was filled with violence and corruption. It uses texts like the Book of Enoch and the Book of Jubilees to paint a picture of an age dominated by these giant offspring, the Nephilim, who became tyrannical, cannibal kings, literally consuming mankind.
Consuming mankind, not just violence, but actual cannibalism on a massive scale.
That's the stark picture painted, particularly in Enoch 7. It describes how the giants, the Nephilim offspring of the Watchers and human women, initially had enormous appetites and consumed all the food resources produced by humans. When that wasn't enough, they turned against humanity, devouring mankind. And then it gets even worse. They started consuming animals, birds, fish, drinking blood, and eventually even turned on each other. It depicts complete breakdown of all moral, spiritual, and natural law. Total chaos ruled by monstrous beings.
And the Book of Jubilees corroborates this. It also describes this level of depravity.
Yes. Jubilees chapter 5 reinforces this terrifying image. It explains that the earth became utterly defiled because of the wicked teachings and violence of the fallen angels, the Watchers, and their giant offspring. These cannibal kings established oppressive regimes characterized by rampant sexual immorality, ritual violence, bloodshed, and utter disregard for life. The corruption was so profound, so widespread, it threatened the very fabric of creation, and the text says the cries of the oppressed reached heaven, demanding judgment.
So this makes the flood seem almost like a mercy killing for the planet. Not just punishment, but a necessary, drastic surgical intervention to cleanse the earth of these hybrid abominations and the rampant evil they perpetuated.
That's exactly how it's framed. Enoch 9 describes the archangels Michael, Uriel, Raphael, and Gabriel looking down, seeing the bloodshed and lawlessness, and petitioning God for intervention. God's judgment followed. The Watchers were bound, the giants were incited to destroy each other, and then the flood came as that cosmic cleansing, wiping the slate clean of the hybrid monstrosities and the pervasive evil that threatened to extinguish all righteous life.
And again, the source connects this horrifying vision to echoes in global mythology. The Titans in Greece, the Jotun in Norse myths. These stories of ancient, powerful, often malevolent giants might be distorted memories of this actual pre-flood era described in Enoch and Jubilees.
It certainly raises that possibility. These widespread myths of primordial giants and cosmic battles could hint at a shared, traumatic, forgotten age of supernatural oppression and suffering, dominated by beings far beyond human scale. The story serves as a profound, terrifying lesson about the dangers of spiritual compromise, the catastrophic potential of forbidden knowledge when misused, and the ultimate consequences of unchecked evil. It's a stark reminder that God's patience has limits, and He will intervene to prevent evil from completely overtaking His creation. It's a chilling warning against aligning with fallen powers.
Absolutely chilling. And this horrifying reality, the reign of cannibal kings, was a direct result, the book argues, of the sins that chained the angels, specifically the forbidden knowledge they imparted. Which leads us into the next section, digging deeper into what exactly those angels did wrong.
Right. Part 3. The depths of angelic rebellion and forbidden knowledge. Starting with Chapter 8, Sins that Chain the Angels. The forbidden knowledge of the Watchers and their imprisonment. This chapter really focuses on the specific transgressions of the Watchers, as detailed primarily in the Book of Enoch, that led to their judgment and imprisonment, connecting these acts back to those biblical anchor points in Jude 1.6 and 2 Peter 2.4.
So we know these Watchers were originally guardians. They broke their oath, led by figures like Semjaza and Azazel. They took human wives. But their sin was compounded by introducing this forbidden knowledge. Can we get more specific about what knowledge Enoch attributes to them?
Enoch 8 is remarkably specific. It attributes particular teachings to specific Watcher leaders. Azazel, for instance, is credited with teaching humans metallurgy to make swords, knives, shields, and breastplates. Essentially, he taught them the arts of sophisticated warfare and manufacturing weapons. This unleashed unprecedented bloodshed and violence.
So he weaponized humanity. What else? Were there other kinds of forbidden knowledge?
Oh, yes. Other Watchers are named as teaching things like enchantments, root cuttings, the use of plants for sorcery, poisons, astrology, divination, reading the signs of the heavens. These practices eroded the boundaries between the spiritual and material realms in dangerous ways, opening humanity up to demonic influence and occult manipulation. They basically gave away secrets of manipulating creation and foretelling the future, bypassing God.
You mentioned cosmetics earlier. That still seems odd compared to sorcery and weapons. How is teaching women the art of adornment considered a chaining sin?
It's interpreted symbolically in this context. Enoch 8 mentions teaching women about costly stones, dyes, and specifically the beautifying of the eyelids. Cole. The interpretation isn't about makeup being inherently evil, but about the watchers teaching the arts of seduction, vanity, manipulation through outward appearance, and the distortion of natural beauty for illicit purposes. It's seen as contributing to moral decay, promiscuity, and a focus on superficiality, a direct affront to the divine order by twisting God's creation for selfish and deceptive ends, rather than purity and godly relationships.
Okay, that adds context. In astrology, the secrets of the stars, how did that fit into the rebellion?
That was seen as a major usurpation of divine authority. By teaching humans to read the stars, interpret omens, and predict the future, the Watchers were essentially encouraging them to try and control fate and bypass reliance on God's providence and guidance. It was an attempt to gain power and knowledge illicitly, to usurp God's sovereignty over time and destiny.
And the sum total of all this forbidden knowledge, warfare, sorcery, manipulation, astrology led to total chaos and corruption.
Exactly. The result was catastrophic.
Yeah.
Violence, injustice, idolatry, sexual immorality, sorcery ran rampant. The giants born from the unions added to the terror. Creation itself groaned under the weight of this corruption. This led directly to God's judgment. The Watchers were forced to witness the destruction of their offspring in the flood, and then they themselves were bound in the abyss, chained in darkness, imprisoned until the final judgment, as Jude and 2 Peter echo. A severe penalty for a severe cosmic crime.
So this story is presented as absolutely foundational for understanding the origins and nature of spiritual rebellion. It's not just abstract evil, it's specific actions, specific knowledge leading to specific consequences.
Precisely. And the book argues these ancient sins aren't just history, they persist as spiritual dangers in the modern world. The temptation towards occult power, forbidden knowledge, military might, vanity, trying to control destiny apart from God. These are timeless temptations, rooted in that original angelic rebellion. It's a blueprint for how evil works.
And the judgment of these watchers, their binding, is a crucial part of Enoch's bigger picture, his prophetic visions. Which brings us to the apocalypse, according to Enoch. The source claims his visions are eerily similar to the book of Revelation.
Yes, chapter 9. The apocalypse, according to Enoch. Prophecies, judgment, and the lost vision of the end times. This is where the parallels become really striking. It compares Enoch's apocalyptic visions, particularly the section known as the Apocalypse of Weeks, Enoch 91 to 105, with the end-time prophecies in the canonical book of Revelation, especially chapters 20-22. And despite Enoch being excluded from most canons, the similarities are hard to ignore.
So Enoch had this grand vision of history laid out, like Revelation's seals, trumpets, and bowls.
Something like that. The Apocalypse of Weeks divides all of human history into 10 weeks or ages. It foresees periods of righteousness, falling away, escalating judgments, including the flood, the giving of the law, the building of the temple, apostasy, dispersion, and then culminates in a final age of judgment and ultimate righteousness. It's a sweeping overview, much like Revelation's structure.
And did Enoch's vision include a Messiah figure, like Christ in Revelation?
Very much so. Enoch speaks powerfully of a figure called the Elect One, the Righteous One, or the Son of Man. This figure is destined to execute judgment on the wicked, to gather and shepherd the righteous, to reveal heavenly secrets, and to establish an eternal dwelling place for the faithful. The parallels to the role and descriptions of Christ in Revelation are quite strong.
What about the resurrection and final judgment? Does Enoch cover those key apocalyptic themes?
Yes, definitely. Enoch describes the resurrection of the dead, both righteous and wicked, for judgment. He speaks of the transformation of the righteous into glorious beings who will inherit the earth and live in eternal light and peace. This mirrors Revelation's promises of victory over death and the creation of a new heaven and new earth. And his vivid portrayal of the final judgment is intense. Hidden deeds are brought to light. Sinners face destruction. Angels are judged. There are strong resonances with Revelation's great white throne judgment scene.
And Enoch seems to place special emphasis on the feet of the fallen angels, the Watchers, connecting their initial rebellion directly to this final judgment.
That's a key element. He consistently ties the cosmic rebellion of the Watchers to the end-time judgment. Their story isn't just an ancient prologue. It's integral to the entire arc of spiritual warfare that culminates in the final judgment. Revelation also touches on judging angels, but Enoch gives it much more detailed background.
So if it's so similar, so resonant with canonical prophecy, why on earth was it excluded? It seems like it would support Revelation.
That's the paradox. The source suggests that its very richness and explicitness might have been the problem for some in the early church as the canon was solidifying. Its detailed supernatural content, angels breeding with humans, specific names of angels and demons, intricate heavenly journeys, and its very specific messianic prophecies might have been deemed too controversial, too specific, or perhaps seen as challenging emerging orthodox views about Christ, angels, or the precise nature of the end times. Maybe it felt like it could destabilize accepted doctrines or give too much credence to what some saw as speculative or non-apostolic traditions.
So ironically, its depth might have led to its marginalization.
That's the argument. And as a result, Enoch offers this compelling alternative lens for understanding biblical prophecy, the cosmic scope of the battle between good and evil, and the hope of resurrection. Its exclusion, the source implies, only heightened the allure of its secrets for those seeking deeper, perhaps less sanitized spiritual truths.
It definitely makes you think about how traditions are formed and what gets prioritized.
Its resurgence in interest today certainly suggests a lasting fascination, a desire to connect those dots between Genesis, prophecy, and the unseen spiritual realm that Enoch addresses so directly.
And just as Enoch's powerful voice was marginalized, the source argues that other significant spiritual voices met a similar fate, particularly Mary Magdalene, whose own gospel offers a very different and similarly censored perspective.
All right, moving on to chapter 10. The censored gospel of Mary Magdalene, silenced voices, and the lost teachings on the soul. This chapter investigates Mary's enigmatic role. It contrasts the glimpses we get in the canonical Gospels, where she's clearly important, with the revelations found in the non-canonical Gnostic Gospel of Mary, and explores why that text was suppressed.
Okay, so in the standard New Testament, Mary Magdalene is definitely presented as a key figure, right? A devoted follower, healed by Jesus, present at the crucifixion.
And crucially, in John's Gospel, she's the very first witness to the resurrection. Jesus appears to her first and sends her to tell the male disciples. That's a hugely significant role. Apostle to the apostles, some have called her.
But then there's this other text, the Gospel of Mary, discovered relatively recently among the Nag Hammadi library in Egypt. How does it portray her?
The Gospel of Mary presents her not just as a witness, but as a favored disciple, perhaps the most understanding disciple. It depicts her receiving secret spiritual instruction from the risen Christ that the other disciples, particularly Peter, didn't receive or couldn't comprehend.
Secret instruction. This sounds like Gnosticism, right? Emphasis on hidden knowledge.
Exactly. It's considered a Gnostic text. Gnosticism was a diverse spiritual movement in early Christianity, emphasizing gnosis, or secret spiritual knowledge, as the path to salvation, often focusing on escaping the flawed material world. Mary's teachings in this gospel center on the nature of the soul, its perilous ascent through hostile spiritual realms after death, and its ultimate liberation from material bondage. It's about inner revelation and mystical ascent, very different from the emphasis in the canonical Gospels.
And the controversy comes from her position, her authority relative to the male apostles.
That's the core of it. The Gospel of Mary clearly implies her spiritual authority was equal to or even surpassing that of the male apostles, because she understood Christ's deeper teachings. There's a dramatic scene where Peter, representing the more institutional or orthodox view, challenges her credibility. He asks essentially, did the Savior really speak secretly with a woman bypassing us? He doubts her. But then Levi, often identified with Matthew, defends her, saying, Peter, you are always hot-tempered. If the Savior made her worthy, who are you indeed to reject her? This scene really highlights the deeper historical conflicts over leadership, gender, and the transmission of spiritual authority in the early formative years of the church.
So the argument is that early church politics, the struggle for control and defining doctrine, led to the marginalization of texts like the Gospel of Mary, and simultaneously a downplaying of Mary Magdalene's actual role and authority.
Precisely. The source mentions Pope Gregory I in the 6th century, officially conflating Mary Magdalene with the unnamed sinful woman who anointed Jesus' feet, from Luke 7, and sometimes also with Mary of Bethany. This composite image of her as a repentant prostitute stuck for centuries, effectively obscuring her primary canonical role as the first resurrection witness and, according to the Gnostic text, a preeminent spiritual teacher.
So suppressing her gospel and redefining her image went hand in hand.
It seems that way. The Gospel of Mary, with its vision of a female apostle receiving and transmitting profound spiritual secrets, posed a direct challenge to the developing patriarchal structure and the emerging apostolic authority centered on Peter and the male disciples. It was systematically sidelined, deemed heretical.
The book argues the censorship is emblematic of a broader pattern of silencing alternative spiritual voices, particularly those of women, in the shaping of Christian doctrine. And that definitely resonates today, with ongoing discussions about historical exclusion and the search for more mystical or experiential paths.
It absolutely does. It reveals that early Christianity was perhaps far more diverse than we often assume, and that the process of establishing orthodoxy involved excluding voices and perspectives that didn't fit the dominant narrative. It makes you question whose version of history we inherited and what other insights might have been lost.
Yeah. And the suppression of texts, of alternative views, often seems connected, the book implies, to this larger ongoing conflict with those ancient rebellious forces we talked about earlier. Which brings us back again to the Watchers specifically. Who were they?
Exactly. Chapter 11 asks, who were the 200 fallen watchers, leaders of ancient rebellion and the end-time mystery of Azazel? This chapter dives deeper into the identities and specific roles of these fallen angels, focusing on their named leaders, particularly the very mysterious figure of Azazel, whose name and influence seem to echo from Genesis through Leviticus and potentially into Revelation.
Okay, so we know from Enoch it was a coordinated cosmic rebellion. Simjaza was the chief who instigated the pact, leading the 200. But Azazel seems to get special attention for his particular contributions to corrupting humanity.
He really does. Enoch 8 singles him out. He's credited with teaching humans how to make swords, knives, shields, and breastplates, basically, the technology of organized warfare and bloodshed. He also taught women about metals, precious stones, and adornment and seduction, twisting beauty into a tool for corruption. He seems to be a primary source of both violence and vanity.
And he received a specific, harsh judgment for this.
A very specific one. According to Enoch 10, the archangel Raphael was commanded by God to bind Azazel hand and foot and cast him into the darkness, in the desert, which is in Judea. He was essentially imprisoned in a desolate, rocky wilderness, covered in sharp stones, to remain there until the great day of judgment.
But then, incredibly, his name pops up in the canonical book of Leviticus in the middle of the instructions for Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. How does that fit?
It's one of the Bible's great mysteries. Leviticus 16 describes the ritual with 2 goats. Lots are cast. One goat is designated for the Lord and sacrificed. The other goat is designated for Azazel. The second goat, the scapegoat, symbolically has the sins of Israel confessed over it, and then it's sent away alive to Azazel into the wilderness.
To Azazel, what does that mean? Is Azazel a place? A demon?
That's the debate. Scholars argue whether Azazel here refers to the desolate location where the goat is sent, or to a demonic entity thought to inhabit the wilderness, or specifically to the fallen watcher leader Azazel, now imprisoned there. The source leans towards linking it to the fallen angel, suggesting the ritual symbolically sends Israel's sins back to one of the primary sources of corruption and rebellion. It hints at Azazel's lingering symbolic power, even in his imprisonment.
And the book even connects Azazel and the legacy of the Watchers to the end times, to figures in the book of Revelation.
Yes. It draws parallels between the imprisoned Watchers, particularly their leader in the abyss, and figures like Abaddon or Apollyon, described in Revelation 9.11 as the king over the abyss, the angel who leads the demonic locusts released during the tribulation. While not a direct equation, the themes of powerful fallen beings imprisoned in darkness, their connection to widespread suffering, and their potential role or release in the end times create intriguing, if speculative, connections. It suggests their story isn't finished.
Understanding these figures, their specific roles and fates, it offers crucial insights into the origins of evil, the dangers of forbidden knowledge, and the ongoing spiritual battle, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Their legacy, as presented in these texts, serves as a potent warning against pride, disobedience, the temptation of forbidden power, and the allure of occultism, or secret knowledge that promises shortcuts but leads to destruction. It suggests these ancient patterns of rebellion are still very relevant today.
A profound reminder that the spiritual battle has deep ancient roots, with consequences that ripple through all of history.
And the history of these rebellious forces, the timeline of creation and corruption, is also deeply intertwined with ideas about sacred time, celestial calendars, and those missing years in the biblical narrative, which brings us to the Book of Jubilees.
Right. Part 4, Unseen Structures and Prophetic Returns. Starting with Chapter 12, the Book of Jubilees and the Missing Years. Time divisions, angelic rulers, and celestial calendars. This book, Jubilees, sometimes called the Lesser Genesis, how does it help us understand these missing years or offer a different structure to history?
Jubilees is fascinating because it essentially retells the narratives of Genesis and the first part of Exodus, but it frames everything within a very specific, rigid chronological structure. It divides all the history from creation onwards into Jubilees periods of 49 years,
Yep.
7 weeks of years. It also uses weeks of years, 7 years, and individual years to date every significant event: births, deaths, covenants, sins, judgments. It implies a divinely ordained timetable for absolutely everything.
So it's like trying to create a perfect, unbroken timeline based on heavenly revelation.
Pretty much. It claims to be a revelation given to Moses on Mount Sinai by an angel, laying out the true, divinely ordered history and its timing.
And it also talks about angels ruling over nations, that idea we touched on with Babel.
Yes, Jubilees makes that explicit. In chapter 15, mirroring that older reading of Deuteronomy 32.8, it states that after the languages were confused at Babel, God appointed spirits or angels to rule over each of the Gentile nations, leading them astray. Israel alone was kept under God's direct rule. This concept, which is less prominent in the final canonical text, really opens up that understanding of spiritual warfare on a geopolitical level. It suggests nations and empires are influenced by contending angelic and demonic powers behind the scenes.
So earthly events have heavenly counterparts or causes. And does Jubilees add to the story of the Watchers in the flood like Enoch does?
It does. It parallels Enoch's account quite closely regarding the descent of the Watchers, their sin with human women, the birth of the Nephilim giants, the spread of violence and corruption, and the necessity of the flood as judgment. By placing these events within its strict 49-year Jubilee cycle, it reinforces the idea that even these catastrophic events and angelic interventions were part of God's precise, preordained plan and timing for purification and reckoning. It strongly affirms that Enochian worldview, where supernatural forces are deeply involved in human history.
And one of the most distinctive things about Jubilees is its insistence on a specific type of calendar, right? A solar calendar.
Yes, that's a major theme and point of contention. Jubilees insists on a 364-day solar calendar, perfectly divisible by 7, composed of 52 weeks. It claims this was the original divinely revealed calendar. It harshly criticizes the lunar calendar, which became standard in later Judaism for calculating festivals, arguing that following the moon leads people to observe Sabbaths, festivals, and holy days at the wrong times, thereby corrupting worship and falling out of sync with the true heavenly rhythm.
So it's a whole controversy about sacred time itself, based on a claim of angelic revelation.
Exactly. It reflects a belief in a divinely instituted cosmic order that includes timekeeping, and aligning human worship with that celestial calendar was seen as crucial for maintaining covenant faithfulness. It highlights how important cosmic alignment was in some ancient Jewish thought.
This book definitely challenges a purely human-centric reading of Genesis. It forces you to consider these unseen spiritual dynamics, these angelic rulers, this divine timetable operating behind history. It really acts as a bridge between Genesis and the later apocalyptic writings.
It absolutely does. It compels readers to envision biblical history not just as a human story, but as a cosmic drama, orchestrated according to a heavenly schedule, involving both human choices and significant angelic intervention, both good and bad. It offers a much more supernaturally charged view of the past.
And digging into these ancient sources, uncovering these patterns of angelic involvement and divine timing, it often leads directly to thinking about end-time prophecy. Specifically, the book concludes with a look at the potential return of two incredibly unique figures from the Old Testament.
Yes, the final chapter explored is chapter 13. Two witnesses are Enoch and Elijah coming back, the return of God's untouchables. This dives into that electrifying prophecy in Revelation chapter 11 concerning the two witnesses who will appear during this tribulation, and examines the strong traditional and scholarly arguments for identifying them as Enoch and Elijah.
It makes a kind of intuitive sense, doesn't it? Because Enoch and Elijah are the only two major Old Testament figures explicitly recorded as not dying. Enoch was taken by God, Genesis 5, and Elijah was swept up to heaven in a chariot of fire, 2 Kings 2.
Their unique departures absolutely set them apart. Having never tasted death, they are seen by many interpreters as uniquely positioned, perhaps even preserved specifically for this special, powerful end-time mission.
And what does Revelation 11 say these two witnesses will actually do?
It's dramatic. They will prophesy in Jerusalem for 1,260 days, 3.5 years, clothed in sackcloth, signifying mourning and repentance. They're given incredible power to perform miraculous signs specifically, shutting up the heavens so it doesn't rain, just like Elijah did, turning water into blood, and striking the earth with plagues. They seem to embody the power of Moses and Elijah combined.
And then things take a dark turn for them before a final triumph?
Yes, the prophecy states that when they finish their testimony, the beast that comes up from the abyss, often identified with the Antichrist, will overcome and kill them. Their bodies will lie unburied in the street of Jerusalem, and the world will actually celebrate their deaths, sending gifts to each other because these two prophets tormented them.
Wow, global celebration over their deaths, but that's not the end.
Not at all. After 3.5 days, the breath of life from God enters them. They stand on their feet, terror strikes those watching, and then they hear a loud voice from heaven saying, "Come up here," and they ascend to heaven in a cloud right in front of their enemies. A stunning vindication.
So why Enoch and Elijah specifically? What's the prophetic basis beyond just them not dying?
Well, Malachi 4.5 explicitly prophesies that God will send the prophet Elijah back before the great and dreadful day of the Lord comes. That's a direct link for Elijah. For Enoch, the connection is often made through Jude 1.14 to 15, which actually quotes a prophecy of Enoch, found in the book of Enoch, about the Lord coming with thousands of his holy ones to execute judgment. This implies Enoch has a continuing prophetic role related to the final judgment. Plus, their combined ministries are seen symbolically. Enoch, the pre-flood prophet, witnessing to the earliest age. Elijah, the fiery pre-exile prophet, representing the law and the prophets. Together, they represent God's enduring witness throughout all history, perhaps to both Gentiles, Enoch predates Israel, and Jews, Elijah.
But why will the world hate them so intensely? Why the global celebration when they're killed?
The source suggests it's because their message will be one of uncompromising truth, repentance, and judgment, delivered with supernatural power. In a world increasingly embracing rebellion, self-worship, and the Antichrist system, their message will be deeply offensive and convicting. They will directly confront global evil, and that will provoke intense ridicule, rage, and ultimately violence.
Yeah.
They will be seen as disruptors of a false peace.
But their resurrection and ascension becomes the ultimate reversal, right? A final, undeniable sign.
Absolutely. It's God's dramatic vindication. It signals that judgment is imminent, that truth cannot ultimately be silenced or defeated, and that God's kingdom will triumph. Their return, ministry, death, and resurrection serve as a powerful, condensed enactment of the entire gospel message and God's ultimate victory over sin, death, and rebellion. It reinforces the idea that prophecy will be fulfilled, no matter how much it's ignored or suppressed.
This really does bring our deep dive full circle, connecting these ancient, often hidden narratives directly to the climax of biblical prophecy. It's quite an arc.
It really is. It shows how these seemingly disparate, sometimes obscure stories can weave together into a much larger, coherent, and profoundly challenging tapestry of spiritual history and future hope.
Okay, wow. And with that, we have to bring this incredibly rich and honestly pretty wild deep dive into Big Brother's Holy Shockers to a close. What a journey that was. We've really gone through a raw, unfiltered exploration today. And I think it's safe to say it's exposed a potential hidden dimension of biblical history, hasn't it? And really highlighted the intense spiritual wars raging behind the scenes right from the very beginning. Just thinking back, we've covered so much ground: the real meaning of death in Eden, the terrifying reality of giants and fallen angels messing with the ancient world, Enoch's absolutely mind-bending heavenly visions and his prophecies, then the spiritual conspiracy behind Babel, uncovering secrets from lost books like Jasher and Jubilees, wrestling with that enigmatic figure of Lilith, exploring the specific sins that got the watchers chained up, plus Mary Magdalene's silenced gospel, and ending with that electrifying prophecy of Enoch and Elijah potentially returning. It's a lot.
It really is. And if you try and connect all these threads, look at the bigger picture. These ancient mysteries, these suppressed narratives, they aren't just historical curiosities. They still resonate powerfully today, don't they? They fundamentally shape or reshape our understanding of that core battle between good and evil, the pervasive nature of spiritual warfare that arguably continues right now, and the unwavering reality of divine justice in the end. This whole deep dive really hammers home that knowledge, especially this kind of knowledge, isn't just about collecting facts. It's most valuable when it's deeply understood, wrestled with, and maybe even applied to how we see the world, how we live our lives. And, leaves us with a pretty important question to chew on, I think.
What's that?
Well, considering how much profound material, how many significant perspectives were apparently hidden or censored or just fell out of the mainstream narratives over the centuries, what else might still be out there waiting to be uncovered?
Yeah.
What does the very existence of these holy shockers imply about the nature of truth itself? And maybe about the ongoing battle right here and now for genuine spiritual understanding in our own world.
That is definitely a question worth pondering, something to really think about after we sign off. We absolutely encourage all of you listening to continue your own exploration. Dig into these texts, these ideas, maybe grab a copy of Big Brother's Holy Shockers itself now that it's out on Amazon, and see where the journey takes you. Seek, and perhaps you shall find. Until next time on our deep dive, keep digging, keep questioning, and definitely keep an open mind.